There's been a lot of stuff going on around education in Oregon. The Portland teachers strike, the Bend teachers negotiations, all have shined light on the funding of Oregon public schools, or lack thereof. In 2023, when I was reporting on the negotiations, I got a good view of the public school funding system, and I got all the recent numbers. It turns out that statewide, schools are short about $100 million from what they need to match rising costs and maintain current service levels without making cuts. They're also about $1 billion short of the money they need to meet Oregon's quality education model. The quality education model is a report commissioned by the Oregon Department of Education to see how much it costs to provide high quality education. And that lack of funding was a big point in the Portland teachers negotiations and in Bend's. When I interviewed Superintendent Cook during the negotiations, he told me that the district was in a hard position. They didn't have enough money to satisfy the union's initial demands and spent the vast majority of their extra money on salary increases. During that interview, Dr. Cook mentioned that the district might need a levy in order to raise more money. The fundamental issue is obvious. The district isn't getting enough money. But the cause requires some more looking. Oregon funds its public schools on a system called average daily membership weighted, that funds schools based on how many students they have and adds a weighting to different types of students: English language learners, students in poverty, and students with special needs. Those school districts with more of those kinds of students get more money, obviously because it costs more to serve those students. However, there is no metric to account for other costs, and well, you know what? I'll let Dr. Cook explain it.
Yeah, well, actually it's even worse than that. It's because of the way the formula is currently right now. First of all, you're weighting, just those examples you gave about weighting, there's also one about having veteran teachers. Veteran teachers cost more than newer to the profession teachers, and so you can have a weighting there. But just as an example, right now, our community is changing, and the amount of student population that we have that qualifies for weighting is actually lower as a percentage of our overall population. And so we are now one of the lowest weighted school districts. We are the lowest weighted school district in the region, and we're one of the lower ones in the state. And so when we talk about the weighting as it relates to enrollment, a district that's 17,000 students like us, that has a lot of weightings, could get 30 or 40 more million dollars from the state based upon those weightings. And so there's actually, it's exacerbated from that lens too. The way that, because we have slightly decreasing enrollment, number one, our funding's gonna go down. Because our weighting is changing over time, our funding goes down. And because the staffing, all of those pieces adding together, the ESSER dollars and the fact that going back to the 21-23 biennium where there's that gap in the average funding where they just failed to meet the needs of that time. All of that comes to this kind of point of right now where most districts in the state are chasing dollars. In the Ben Lapine School District, it's a little worse because of that gentrification of our community. And so our reduction in staffing is a moderate reduction this year, and that's because we've been really diligent and good stewards with taxpayers' dollars to try to be as efficient as we can. And so now we're moving into this next year, and we would be in a position that many districts are, which is the state is going to have to fund to the extent that they can. And so if they can step into it with a better funding source or more, then we should be in pretty good shape. But if they don't, then this levy becomes all that more important.
That's the gap they need to fill with this levy. So let's get into how the levy works. It's a property tax that taxes $1 for every $1,000 of assessed property value. Now I need to explain something here. There is a difference between assessed value and the market value of a house. The median home price in Bend is $850,000, but the median assessed value is $238,750. The assessed value is calculated for tax purposes by the county clerk and is usually a lot less than the market value. It varies a lot. Your assessed value could be closer to the market value. It depends on how new your house is and other factors. The district predicts that the levy would give them approximately $21.2 million in the first year. And this levy is only for 5 years, as that is the limitation on how long a school levy can remain without being voted on again. Now, it's time to answer some questions. My first question was how the district came up with the formula for the levy.
It's pretty specific. You can either ask for a rate of tax or you can ask for a fixed amount of tax. And so when we were actually polling our community, this actually goes all the way back to last year when the board said, please investigate what it would look like to present a possible levy request on this community. Gosh, we've been talking about this for over a year. This is school districts that have local levies. Those are funded through property tax levies. And so effectively what you look at is what are the increased amount of resources we would need to meet the additional priorities that we want to focus on, whether it's something new that we want to introduce or whether it's extra funding for an existing priority. And you look at what those needs might be, then you ask your taxpayers in polling to determine what they might be receptive for as far as how much you would tax them. Some levies are as low as 75 cents per thousand and lower of assessed value. And I think Portland Public Schools is the highest, I believe, in the state at $1.99 per thousand of assessed value. And so when you look at the priorities and what we would spend the money on, balanced with what we believe there might be some receptivity in the community for, that helps you determine what the right ask is. And we believe the $1 per thousand of assessed value, it's about $20 a month. 65 cents a day is what we're speculating that there might be enough receptivity in this community to do that. And so we presented that to our board, and the board voted to approve for us to go forward with that particular ask. And so that's where that $1 per thousand came from.
Okay. So what happens if the levy doesn't pass?
So right now we're building the budget for this season. We build a budget every single year, and we're building the budget predicated on there not being a levy. And that budget process, right now, we've proposed the very first meeting with our school board. We proposed a 3% reduction in overall expenditures based upon what we anticipate for revenues this year. Revenues are determined by a couple of things, and that is the funding level by the state, assigned by the state, and then enrollment. It's actually more specifically weighted enrollment. Yeah. Because we're in the second year of a biennium, we have a pretty decent idea of what to expect with that. So this year we can see what we believe to be the right path forward on that. We're going to float some fund balance this year to help us close that budget, but using about $7 million of fund balance that we have managed to hold on to this year into next year's budget allows us to build a budget that is only a 3% reduction in overall costs with personnel. 3% reduction in overall personnel costs equates to about 60 less positions across the district. And so if the levy doesn't pass, that's the first place we'd feel that is those positions would not exist in next year's budget. So if the levy doesn't pass, we can build this year's budget with a good kind of intention on just a slight reduction in overall expenditures. The issue we run into long term, though, is that right now, based on the economists' projections for what we anticipate for funding for next year, they've given us the first number that we tend to hear, which is they're anticipating a 6.1% increase in overall funding. If that is the amount that we would be receiving, we would have to double those cuts for the 25-26
Because
budget.
of increased costs?
Increased costs, a lot of different factors that are involved here. Much of it's, I've talked about several things. The first one that is important is this is the last year of using ESSER dollars. 2024, September, those dollars have to be spent or sent back. And so over 3 different payments, we got approximately $30 million of one-time money to help bolster the overall budget for the district for the period of about 2020 till now. And so that's $30 million over, 4-year period. Yeah. Our annual budget, operating budget is 4 years ago was about $200 million. Now it's about $218 million as we go into next year. And so you can see how much that is and related to the overall budget. And the other factor I think that is really important to talk about is the funding in this biennia was at $10.2 billion for all the districts in the state. That was legislators responding to our ask. What it also doesn't account for is the fact that was about a 10% increase on previous year biennia's funding. The funding in the 21-23 biennia the same years that we received all these federal subsidy dollars, the ESSER dollars. That increase that year was 3.3% for that biennia, which is a dramatically less. We've averaged since the recession, each biennia we've averaged about 10 to 11% in increased funding over those 2 years. Those ESSER dollars have to be spent or sent back. You often hear us referring to what we call the ESSER funding cliff. And that's anytime you're using one-time dollars to fund ongoing positions.
But as a student in a classroom, what will I see if the levy passes or doesn't pass?
I anticipate next year you would see larger class sizes slightly. In 2 years you would see, we've done the math on this, we estimate that there would be fewer kids getting access to the advanced coursework that they want. We would have less seats in our career tech ed pathways. The biggest, I think, feel we would see in a couple of years is that class sizes would increase by about 4 students per class size. And so your experience as a student would be that there's less educators, less counselors, less educational assistants, less administrators. We would continue to reduce staffing across the entire district.
So if you do get the levy, how are you going to work out allocating the funds?
So we've called those out, how those would likely be spent by level and what resources and what priorities, the way that we would allocate them. We would allocate, and every school would see some benefit. Every one of our neighborhood schools and magnet schools would see some benefit, whether it's just additional staff due to keeping class sizes in check, or whether it's additional staff like elementary counselors. We could have increased hours at each of our elementary schools for staffing to do for student counselors. For counselors that help students. Or that's just more student support positions, educational assistants and special education teachers. Those are the ways that we would be allocating these dollars, and across the system and we build our system right now. We kind of do the math allocation of what does it mean to have total staffing across all 33 of our schools, and then we plug in where there's additional needs based upon unique situations in each of those schools. And so if the levy passes, it would be allocated in much the same fashion. That's the way we build our regular budget as well.
The ultimate problem of a lack of state school funding isn't going to be solved by this levy, and I think we should keep that in mind when this comes to our ballots on May 21st. Levies passing may be a sign to the state that more funding isn't needed because localities are prepared to pay. It's tough. I hope they learn their lesson either way. It still remains to be seen if this levy will pass, but based on the fact that other levies, like most recently the fire levy, have passed, and the fact that the levy only needs a simple majority to pass, I think it will. I hear my parents complain more about property taxes, but that's the way it is. You can find more information on Ben Lepine's website and from the Bulletin story. I'll link that below. And maybe check out the website. We got some great stories up this week. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.